Kick off. Let's go. Hello and welcome everybody. This is Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association in New York, and with us today is a return guest, Carey Gillam, who is the new lead, I presume I'm pronouncing that properly,
You got it.
and Reuters and The Guardian, and has been a guest here before and is, how should we say, been harassing is the wrong word, but been on the case of Monsanto and Bayer and Pfizer and 3Ms and the other chemical companies for many years. Her books include Whitewash, The Story of a Weed Killer, Cancer and the Corruption of Science, and the irrelevant one, the Monsanto Papers, Deadly Secrets, Corporate Corruption, and One Man's Search for Justice. And Carey, award-winning journalist, has been delving into not just what these chemicals do, because that's on the record. There are people in labs with test tubes and white coats who have been studying that, but what the people in the back rooms with the suits and the clipboards do to make sure that it never gets to the public and that the research is binned. One of the concerns you mentioned, I think, in the recent stuff about the EPA, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has of course blown hot and cold depending on which administration there is in the White House, and about they're getting instructions about just how activist or otherwise or zealous they should be in pursuing the dangers. So after all of these years, you've looked, the forever chemicals seem to be forever. They're still around and they're spreading. The weed killer, when I did a glyphosate search, the first thing I discovered was your name. The second thing was how to order a bargain size email delivered to your home, a couple of gallons of glyphosate.
Right.
So the message isn't getting out as well as it should do. What is your kind? It must be very frustrating. You keep sounding the alarm and crying wolf, and yet people keep inviting the wolf packs in.
I don't know. I mean, I think as a journalist, the job is to tell the truth, right? The job is to find the facts that maybe are hard to find and to bring them into the spotlight, put them out there so that people who make the policies and, set the regulations and pass the laws, and the consumers who buy the products, that these people can have awareness and education. So that's the way I look at it. I guess I think collectively that's what journalism is all about. And I think we make a difference in little ways and sometimes big ways. And you just keep doing what we're supposed to be doing. So yeah, I mean, glyphosate, is something that I guess I've become very closely associated with because of my two books, because of my work at Reuters and since then. But, Bayer, which bought Monsanto, has said that they have stopped selling it to consumers in the United States as of this year. And certainly, there have been a lot of changes in different countries have looked to ban it. So I think the awareness certainly has been elevated over the last few years, and people are starting to take note, and it is making a difference. I hope a little bit. The fact that knowledge has been expanded about the health risks associated with this chemical and many others, right? Many others that we journalists have been writing about for a number of years.
But the idea that because glyphosate is now not for sale on, well, they're not making it for retail sale. It's a bit like, well, okay, most of our households gave up on lead smelting a long time ago. But it doesn't mean that we encourage lead smelters on an industrial scale. And this is roughly what's happening. The stuff's being poured over farmland everywhere. It's being used in parkland settings and others. It's been I remember on British Rail, it was used to get the weed down on the tracks. I know, because I was soaked in it. I've had a charmed life over the years. So it really does cry out for legislative action. If something is dangerous, then it should be stopped.
Well, there certainly is a lot going on, yeah, and a lot to unpack still, certainly with glyphosate, which is, the active ingredient in the Roundup herbicide that many people know that brand name, and a lot of other brand names and a lot of other products. It's the most widely used weed killing chemical in the world, sold in hundreds of different products, and yes, used very commonly in agriculture, but also parks and playgrounds and things like that. And there's a lot of science that shows that it's harmful to the environment, to the health of soil, to pollinators, as well as posing a risk for cancer and other, adverse health impacts in people. There's a lot of countries that have looked to ban it. Right now, there's a battle going on between Mexico and the United States, and the State Department is really pushing Mexico not to ban glyphosate. They intervened when Thailand tried to ban glyphosate. They really are fighting, our US government is fighting tooth and nail on behalf of the industry. And they would say on behalf of farmers who want to use this chemical to keep it in circulation and to keep it, in that top spot of use internationally.
That's really perverse in a way. We're saying it's too dangerous for households here, but we can sell it to farmers here. And we're insisting and bludgeoning with threatened sanctions other countries to accept it against their better wishes. So, I mean, there are a few ethical disconnects there, aren't there?
I mean, certainly a lot of people see it that way, right? The government and the companies would argue, that this chemical is needed, and they do argue that this chemical is essential for the economic health of farmers and, for countries overseas that are trying to, it's essential to help feed the world, is their argument. Glyphosate, Roundup, what I've said before is that this is really, I think, the poster child for a much bigger sort of issue and problem, because certainly you can argue that the chemicals that we use in agriculture and in the environment do come with some benefits, right? If they didn't, they probably would never sell a drop of them, right? They do bring benefits, and you get those trumpeted and public relations, press releases and all sorts of things all the time from these big companies. But what's the job of journalists and others is, well, what are the risks? What are the costs? What are the costs to us as a society in terms of our health, in terms of the environment? And that's something that really has been, my focus, is trying to expose these risks and these costs. And there are a lot of them. And so it's the government's job, regulators, to weigh those risks and those benefits, just as we do with any other product, right? Or thing that we consume or use. They usually come with risks and they usually come with benefits. But what you see in the chemical industry is that the risks have been, very actively hidden. And the industry has worked very hard to manipulate the facts and manipulate science, manipulate the regulators, and not only hide the risks, but create their own sort of scientific narrative to mislead consumers and mislead others. And that's, where the body of my work has really focused. The politics of it and all of that is something for other people, I think, to handle, to deal with.
I mean, in your work, you found the chemical industry seems to have followed the playbook of the tobacco industry in making sure that the scientists get it right by hook or by crook, so that unfavorable reports tend to get suppressed or dissed in a major way, and the favorable ones are blown up out of all proportion. And if you can't find them favorable enough, you buy them, it would appear. How blatant and obvious is the idea of buying scientists? Because it does seem to be frequent that they will actually get scientists on their payroll producing favorable reports, exonerating their products.
Right, yeah. So, I've written 2 books that involve Monsanto, right? And they in different ways expose and rely on internal corporate documents, a lot of internal corporate documents from Monsanto that show indeed, paying outside scientists, paying people that looked like they were independent scientists. They wanted people to believe they were independent. They used these third parties to try to promote their product and to try to craft scientific narratives that were positive and supportive of the chemical and what they were trying to sell. That was very much embedded in their, their culture and their freedom to sell, freedom to operate. They called it FTO, freedom to operate. But what I've seen, and I guess what is really just frustrating, sad, crazy, is that it's not one company. I just over the last year or so, I've written about Syngenta and what it was doing with its chemical called paraquat, which is another big chemical used in agriculture. And some of the stuff, I thought my eyes popped open when I read the Monsanto internal files. When I read the Syngenta internal files, thousands of pages of documents that I was able to obtain. Again, it's jaw-dropping when you see sort of the level of deception that these companies are engineering and pursuing to try to hide the risks associated with their chemical. And, we have documents going back to the 1950s for Syngenta and a company, Chevron, which was the distributor for paraquat back in the 1970s and 80s.
That was an oil company, wasn't it?
Well, they had a whole number, but when their chemical division or their chemical unit at one time was the sole distributor for paraquat in the United States. And you see them very worried in the 60s and the 70s and into the 80s about the science they were finding about this chemical crossing the blood-brain barrier and the damage that it could do in the brain, and what they were starting to see in animal tests and what they were starting to hear back in terms of humans that had been poisoned or had exposures, and what was happening to them with their central nervous system and damage to the central nervous system, autopsies showing the chemical in the brain and the damage it could do in the brain. And yet their public message was it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, would never do this kind of harm to humans, could be safely used, wasn't something that people had to worry about inhaling or using. And this deception, goes on up until today. I mean, the documents show us pretty much. I could talk about this all day long, but it just, and in the 2000s, you see them really becoming worried about outside scientists and the research that independent scientists were doing that was showing paraquat as a cause of Parkinson's disease, a disease, that originates when cells in the brain, specific types of cells, dopamine producing neuron cells in the substantia nigra part of the brain, when those cells are damaged, it causes Parkinson's disease. And there's science that Syngenta was well aware of that shows that the chemical causes, damage to the dopamine producing neurons in the substantia nigra part of the brain. So, in the very same format, and yet rather than, you don't see them discussing, gosh, I wonder if we should do something to mitigate potential risk to consumers, or I wonder if we should explore a different formulation, or I wonder, what you see them doing is, we've got to come up with a plan to protect ourselves and protect our sales. And we've got to, shut down this independent scientist from advising the EPA.
Like you mentioned the Paraquat Action Squad, which wasn't there to sort of parachute in, decontamination units and medical units. It was to shut off all mention of it. It was a PR action squad.
Right. They called it a SWAT team. They called it their paraquat SWAT team. To take immediate action when outside science was showing harm associated with their chemical, and how they could quash it or counter it or something like that. And They brought in lawyers. You see them, the science is starting to build to such a degree, Syngenta starts to worry that they're going to get sued, which they are right now. There's massive nationwide litigation against the company alleging paraquat causes Parkinson's disease. And they're facing their first trials here in October. And you see them back in 2008, 2007, worried they're going to be sued. And so they start bringing in lawyers to tell their scientists how to design a study, how to write their scientific notes, how to craft everything scientifically so that it can help them in litigation they expect to be filed down the road.
Yes, so they look at the scientific reports to make sure that nothing admits possible liability down the road. But
it just was really astounding, though, to see the lawyers involved and even talking about how it's not going to look good if people know lawyers are involved with the scientist. So they really don't want people to find that out. They talk about that in the emails as well.
lawyer is almost worth his fee right away.
And and right, and bringing in again, outside scientists and paying them, hiring them as consultants or something else, and then these scientists, author papers that don't mention that they've worked with Syngenta.
Any evidence that this was sort of calculatedly above board, like going to a distinguished biochemist and saying, well, here we've got the riches beyond the dreams of avarice as long as you produce the right results? Or was it nudge, nudge, wink, wink? Well, we've got this chemical and we want an objective study, okay? And it could be long-term work or it could be short-term work. It's up to you.
Yeah.
I mean, was it phrased in this nudge, nudge, wink, wink way, or?
It's I think that's open to interpretation, really. I haven't seen what you would say a smoking gun where we want you to fraudulently fudge data, that sort of thing. Certainly, I have not seen anything like that. But
I've had enough journalists, I've had enough friends who have worked for the Fox media who know which side the bread gets buttered on and do not
sure.
read
I mean,
instructions.
when you're being paid by a company to come up, to do work, and these scientists, I've talked to them. There's specifically 3 scientists that Syngenta employed, and these 3 scientists wrote a paper at the very time, when Syngenta was worrying that it was going to get sued, and this paper, was favorable or supportive. It's a paper that Syngenta points to on its website as something that supports their position that it doesn't cause Parkinson's disease. But again, the paper doesn't say that these authors did work for Syngenta, that they were paid money by Syngenta. It doesn't disclose that. Do they need to do that or do they not? They didn't think that they did. They thought they met all the requirements for an honest disclosure. So were their results skewed by the fact that they got money from Syngenta? They say no. They say they're independent scientists doing independent work. So again, it's all open to interpretation. But if you don't have reporting, if you don't have the documents, you don't even know there was that relationship.
You mentioned this up to interpretation, because one of the difficulties here is that lay people, in fact, most of us tend to see science in binary terms. Something is either yes or no, safe or unhealthy, proven or not proven. When in fact, most of these reports are 50 or more shades of gray. Well, maybe a little bit, or maybe it's not very good for you, or I'm not quite sure I'd like it on my breakfast. But there are a lot of shades of caution in there, and it's one of the things during the COVID epidemic when government officials in Britain kept referring to the science. And of course, they were talking about social science, which isn't a science at all, as far as I'm concerned. But the science says, what does the science say? Can people get a handle of this? When people often are amazed to the idea that 50-50 means half and half. You know, it's basic.
Yeah, and clearly you're right. Exactly. I don't think lay people do understand that scientific research is, at least in my opinion, very rarely definitive. You know, I don't know that I've ever seen, or maybe I have, you know, a study, and I've read thousands of scientific studies for my work, that says this very definitely causes this, you know, no question about it, bam, this causes this. Now, clearly there are some things out there, but in my work and for the chemicals that I look, the agricultural chemicals, that's the specialty that I focus on, you know, it's always a building block onto other science, you know, and almost always at the bottom of the scientific study, it will say more research is needed. You know, we think more research is needed. It's very difficult to tie. Yeah, it's very difficult to definitively link one environmental contaminant, you know, one thing that's used in the environment with one specific disease in a specific individual, right? Or even in people generally, because we're all exposed to so many different things and so many different doses on different days, and we're not lab rats, so you don't put people into a cage and monitor exactly their exposures. And the chemical companies exploit that, right? They exploit that difficulty, and so from their view, you know, if you can't prove it definitively beyond a shadow of a doubt, you know, then their chemicals should be used and it should be safe. And the regulators have kind of gone along with that. And this nuance and all of this sort of, you know, shades of gray that we talk about does allow for the companies, gives them the opportunity to tell the regulatory agencies how they should interpret the data. And there are rules in place for how regulators should do it. But those rules don't always get followed. And we've seen real life examples of that. And in the US EPA, we have currently whistleblowers, scientists who work for the EPA, who have come out to tell Congress and testify and publicly state the science is being manipulated. The science is being altered and censored and manipulated inside the agency to benefit the companies trying to sell these chemicals. And they say it's causing real world harm. And we are putting chemicals that cause cancer and other diseases out into the world, allowing them to be out there in our food and our water and our air to benefit the companies. And, you know, that hasn't gotten nearly enough media play, in my opinion. I mean, that's outrageous. And you barely see any coverage of that. But that's a real thing right now that's going on. And it has been going on for the last couple of years since these scientists came out.
Now there's the principle, the precautionary principle. If you're introducing chemicals with chlorine and fluorine that you know are long-lasting into the environment, then you'd assume that some degree of the precautionary principle applies. Is it's up to you to prove they're not going to do any harm. You can say, well, okay, the Romans used lead in the plumbing and it took 400 years to kill them all off, so we can be forgiven for overlooking, you know, a few peccadillos like that. There's other stuff, you know, the amount of what the sulfur in the atmosphere has done from the burning of coal. You can say it took a few hundred years for us to work that out, but now we know this stuff is there, and we know anything containing fluorine and chlorine is likely to be disadvantageous to long-term health. Even salt, sodium chloride, sodium fluoride, definitely, of course. So you assume that the government will say, no, before you can introduce that, you have to go through certain hurdles. But that's not the case, is it? Basically, anyone can introduce something at the moment.
Well, you know, I don't know. Again, I think there's nuance to that. I know that companies that are trying to introduce new products now, I mean, registration is a very onerous process. for new chemicals. They have to jump through a number of hoops. They have to submit a whole array of scientific studies, check the box, check the box, check the box, check the box. You got to do this, you got to, spend this much money and demonstrate all of these things to the regulators. So it's not, I guess, just anybody can do anything, but you certainly don't see the regulators turning these companies down either, and I can't remember if it was The Intercept or ProPublica, but there has been reporting that looks at, exactly how many of these registrations, these attempts to bring these new chemicals to market, how many do get turned down? And it's like virtually none. So, to a degree, what you're saying is true. But again, they are checking some boxes now, how they're checking them. We have a history in the industry of fraudulent companies, scientific companies that actually created fraudulent data for chemical companies to give to the EPA. And people have gone to jail over that. Whether or not those companies are still creating fraudulent data, I don't know. But we do know that there's an effort that's been underway to manipulate and censor anything that is showing harm or risk of these chemicals that are owned by and registered by these very powerful companies like Bayer and Syngenta, Bayer being former Monsanto, and Dow, Corteva, DuPont. The PFAS situation that so many reporters out there are familiar with, that we've been hearing about and writing about, and the recent settlements, 3M and DuPont, who are the originator, the big dogs who have been using and making and distributing PFAS throughout the world for decades. It's the same story. You have documents dating back to the 50s or the 60s that show, in the 70s and all, that show they were very well aware of the harm and the persistent nature of these chemicals, that they could not easily be cleaned up or eradicated, that they were persistent, that they don't break down in the environment, and that they accumulate in human blood, and that they have harmful impacts, specifically, birth defects and reproductive problems. And they hid it all. They hid it from the regulators for years and years and years. So, and they're still trying to downplay the harm, even though it seems almost, incontrovertible at this point. And the EPA has launched, and the Biden administration has launched a huge program to try to limit and clean up the use of certain types of PFAS in the environment. But still to this day, even they're agreeing to pay, was it 3M agreeing to pay almost $11 billion to do some cleanup, and DuPont is little over $1 billion. But they're still trying to downplay the harmful impacts. So,
but presumably they still end up making money. If we think of the opioids with the sacklers, they have they pay oodles of money, but all of the actual principals seem to have picked up the money and run away. It's hidden in shell companies. They've loaned money. They've loaned money which they've forgiven. I don't see any of the Sacker family on the street with plastic cups outside the Metropolitan Art Museum, for example, claiming
I know, right?
It's them, but none of them seem to suffer. Do you see shareholders of Bayer anywhere with the hats on?
Yeah, I don't know. Some of the shareholders have been suing Bayer lately, saying that they have been injured because Bayer bought Monsanto. And what kind of idiotic move was that, to buy a company?
I was actually going to come on to that. I mean,
that was being sued at the time for one of its leading products, because the International Agency for Research on Cancer had said that it likely causes non-Hodgkin lymphoma, probably causes non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and cancer in humans. And Bayer says, no big deal. We'll go ahead and buy this company, $63 billion, no big deal. In less than 2 months, they're hit with their first, court loss.
That one always struck me as an outrageous example of why due diligence is urged on investors. I mean,
Yeah,
were they not aware? There was a history of litigation already, and they went ahead and bought it anyway.
they went ahead and bought it anyway. And, I think it is at the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post that called it like one of the worst business deals in all of history or something, and yeah, investors. And of course, the CEO who oversaw that is now out at Bayer. And they're now, the rumor on the street is that they're looking to divest of Monsanto's business line. It's been so disastrous for them in terms of the liability. They've agreed to pay roughly now, I think they're up to $15 billion to settle as much litigation as they can, but they're still facing trials. There are more trials that are coming up in the next few months over this Roundup cancer connection. So they've been litigating this, they've been trying to settle, and they're trying to shed this, I think, as quickly as they can, because it was a huge mistake, at least in the eyes of the investors.
So are they trying to settle in a genuine way, or just to make the lawsuits go away?
Well, I mean, that's what the settlement is all about, right? So they settled over, I think the number was close to 100,000 cases, and they continue to do that. Their trials, what you're seeing if you're tracking the trials is the ones that they look likely to lose, the cases they look likely to lose, they settle them on the eve of trial. The ones that they think that they have a pretty good case, maybe the plaintiff's case isn't as strong, they're going ahead and trying those, and they've been winning. They've won the last 5 or 6 trials in the Roundup litigation. So, in the last year or so.
Mm-hmm. There are examples in the past of products like asbestosis, or even the black lung, the pneumocystis from the coal industry, where there were industry scale settlements to make sure the victims were looked after. Has anything like that been proposed for the weed killer or the PFOS cases?
Well, so for glyphosate, there has been an effort to establish like a class, like going forward, so that people who might have claims or might develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma in the future that they believe or they can show is tied to their use of glyphosate or Roundup, that would cover them or protect them. There's been that sort of effort, but it's really been difficult to achieve that kind of thing. Bayer has been unable to figure out so far how to put a cap on the liability, because it is such a widely used product and it's been used so many years, and non-Hodgkin lymphoma is something that can develop 10, 20 years or more after your exposures. So that's a difficult task I think to wrap up that litigation.
Well, in times past, when we believed in government intervention, the government would have taken a hand in this, wouldn't it? Is that out the question now?
I don't know. I remember the famous, not famous, I wrote about it. I guess I didn't make it famous, but a message from the White House that I can't remember the exact wording. I think it was the White House has Monsanto's back on glyphosate. This would have been during the Trump administration.
I was about to say, I can't.
Would have been during the Trump administration. But I'm not sure it's any different under any other administration. I mean,
They wouldn't be foolish enough to put it on the record, though, I suspect the others.
I mean, the EPA in the 1980s had its own scientists look at data provided by Monsanto on this chemical glyphosate and say, this looks oncogenic. This looks like it could cause cancer. And Monsanto protested and told the upper management that their stupid scientists weren't, evaluating things properly, and that Monsanto would tell them how to evaluate it. And they won that battle, and the scientists were overruled, and the EPA determined that it didn't look like it caused cancer. So, clear back in the 80s.
So for reporters looking at this, are there any angles for the international press on places where the international exposures are being covered, or you've already mentioned Mexico and some of the others where the the US government is determinedly trying to export what it considers stuff that's toxic at home, but it's okay to send to them, they're foreigners. Are there any other alerts you might want to put out for people to look into
Well,
this?
I mean, certainly with respect to glyphosate, it's the European Union right now is going through the process of whether or not to renew the registration of glyphosate at the end of the year, whether or not to allow continued sales of this in the European Union or not. And the last round was 5 years ago. That was 2017 or 2018. Well, I'm losing, things have been extended here, but it was late 2017 when they were supposed to do a renewal, and it was very close. It came down to the wire at that point, and the day for Monsanto was saved when the German ag minister came in with a very surprising vote. Germany at that time had said it would abstain from voting on a glyphosate renewal, and instead the German ag minister went outside the rest of the ministers and came in to vote yes, that it could continue to be on the market. And that was December 2017, which of course was just a few months before Bayer, the German company, completed its purchase of Monsanto. So all of that was very interesting. We are now doing that again, with a vote that will be upcoming, and the science is being evaluated, and there's a lot of argument and dispute over how to look at the science, and is the science being manipulated? What are the political pressures that are being applied? What are all the connections? Follow the dots, follow the money. So anybody in Europe, you might want to really start digging into that. There's a great news hook for it, obviously.
Yeah, and what was one of the reasons for Brexit was that they wanted to get Britain outside of the European Union protections and legislation. And one of the first things that allegedly was that America was to sell the British hormones in beef and chlorine in chicken, as I remember, plus sundry other issues, I'm sure. But it was it's the issue of environmental protection legislation is really strong, especially when tied in with trade promotion, because the US government in the past was introducing sanctions against, you mentioned Thailand before,
Right.
in connection with the glyphosate, but as I remember, we did the same to them about tobacco and the Australians because of introduction of what were regarded as anti-Philip Morris.
Gosh, I don't know about the tobacco, but yeah, that's not surprising. And all of this really does mirror what we saw with the tobacco industry. And, whole books have been written about this by different academics who study corporate conduct and corporate misconduct. And so it's not really my opinion necessarily. It's just, I guess, what I am believing and hearing from all of these different academics who study this issue, and from looking at documents that have come out through the tobacco industry, that it's very much a playbook. It's step by step, engage third parties who can secretly represent your best interests, and people won't know that you're paying them or aligning with them, so they'll seem to be credible and objective and independent. That's very much a part of the playbook that tobacco use and the chemical industry uses. Funding the science, right? Engaging outside scientists and having them author papers that are going to be very supportive to you. Monsanto, I've written about this. I mean, they had one of the most influential papers that regulators have looked at, and that has been pointed to around the world by regulatory agencies, is one that was called Williams, Crows, and Monroe. Those were the three authors, William, Crows, and Monroe. And those three authors appeared to be independent of Monsanto. And you see in the Monsanto files and their documents that Monsanto, they had a number of their own people who worked on that. They had one of their top scientists who edited it. They were so proud of all the work that Monsanto did on that supposedly independent paper that they celebrated with like a little party when it was getting ready to be published, and had commemorative shirts made up for their people. And they talk internally about, how proud they are of all the work they did on this independent paper and how it was going to serve them so well internationally in their defense of glyphosate. How much more blatant the scientific fraud, and they refer to that paper in their internal documents as ghost written, how they ghost wrote that paper. And, that goes on all the time is what we're finding.
Well, we know from personal experience in the Foreign Press Association, Monsanto and Bayer are sort of quite careful to work hard on getting other people to write stuff for them. One of the questions coming in is, what happened to the EU investigation into Monsanto's overt and covert attacks on the media and individual journalists?
Nothing, right? Nothing that I recall. They went and they looked at it, and I think Bayer, if I'm recalling right, Bayer appointed like an independent or hired an independent law firm or whatever to look through, and they had some files and some names, but nothing ever happened. Nobody ever got fired. Nothing ever transpired. I think they said they were going to put better controls on to, not engage in the type of behavior that Monsanto had engaged in. Bayer did to separate itself from Monsanto's past conduct. But they claim they're a new company, a different company, and they would never do that sort of thing. And
so we know from personal experience that there are no repercussions for corporate officials who tried to buy the Foreign Press Association.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one thing that that's one thing we see repeatedly, right? When you have corporate misconduct, even when it comes to this level, the New York Attorney General recently hit Bayer, I can't remember, I'd have to look up the fine, for false advertising of its Roundup and glyphosate, and hit him with a fine, and they'd hit Monsanto with a fine years ago. Fines are paid. Monsanto at one point, many years ago, had to pay a fine for trying to bribe public officials in India or Indonesia or one of those countries over there. I can't recall now, but no one ever goes to jail. It's civil penalties. It's basically a cost of doing business. People don't actually have their lives or their livelihoods impacted for this bad conduct, even though the results of the bad conduct directly impact the health and well-being, potentially millions of people, right, around the world. So I think that's a deep flaw in our system, that when you have this type of conduct and it is exposed, people should be held accountable, and they just never are.
Well, it is at every level, of course, of corporate governments that you've got corporate citizenhood, but no corporation ever goes to jail, nor the directors.
Right. And when they get really, really down to they just can't escape the liability, you often see them spin that liability off, into another company. Monsanto did that with PCBs when it spun it off into Solutia, and then Solutia filed for bankruptcy. I think you've seen that over and over again, where companies start to get into trouble and they just create a new entity and go through a series of mergers and spin-offs and things like that, and then bam, they say, oh, that's not us, that's Solutia or Corteva.
If they're studying the tobacco industry so assiduously, one of the things that they could notice is how the major tobacco giants hived off the profitable stuff to put to one side, and then they hived off the international stuff to one side and left the domestic stuff, which they insulated by basically fessing up. They say confession is good for the soul, and the tobacco settlement was good for the soul because basically it set a limit on how much they would pay in compensation. And so it was a variable factor. I mean, it was an invariable factor for now onwards in terms of their share sales. Everybody knew how much the Reynolds and Philip Morris and were going to pay, and all they did was increase the prices of the tobacco.
Yeah.
As one engagingly said, our customers are addicts. they'll pay whatever we ask them to.
If people, I mean, I don't know if everybody would be aware of this. It's been around for a while, but those tobacco industry documents, you can read those, you can dig through and search those. At the UCSF has the tobacco industry documents. They have a UCSF library, also has the chemical industry documents. They have a lot of the Monsanto, they have the Dow DuPont. They just did, some of the researchers just did a report not too long ago. When was that? June. I think it was early June, analyzing those documents from, I'm sorry, I said Dow DuPont, 3M and DuPont. And they have the tobacco industry documents. They have Monsanto. They're taking the paraquat ones from Syngenta that I was able to obtain that are not really available anywhere else, other than, well, on the new lead. We put them on the new lead, this little website that I've started with the backing of the Environmental Working Group. And so, reporters can go and dig through those and find stories and history and relevance to things that they're writing about now. And, I did just see a story, I can't remember who did it, based on those documents on PFAS. So there's still a lot there to mine, I think. It's never too late to, put these facts in a spotlight for people.
Yes, archives could be very newsworthy if you mine them again.
Right.
It's like the slag heaps, they always contain mineral minerals if you know how to get into them.
Right.
So we have to get we'll have to put that up on our site for people to look at and go chasing, and they can presumably go. Are there any more questions out there, people? Any of you killing weeds at the moment?
If not, I'd like to give a shout out to the new lead and just to say, we are looking for freelancers. I've got a good little group of freelancers and my permanent staffers, full-time staffers, but we just started up in last May, I guess it is, Val. Well, no, a little over a year. And, as I said, it's an initiative of the Environmental Working Group, and we're just trying to do really good environmental journalism and looking for good freelancers. So we would welcome that.
Well, there you go, people. Opportunities. You can do the Lord's work and advance your career at the same time.
Exactly.
It's so explain the new lead. What it is? It's a website, or it's a...
We're a new environmental news outlet, started in May of 2022, initiative of the Environmental Working Group. I'm sure people are familiar with Environmental Working Group. It's one of the largest and best read, I guess, best known research group looking at the environment. They have a number of scientists on staff and collect data from the EPA and other resources and crunch it and make it available to consumers and lawmakers, and talk to lawmakers and put out reports and do all sorts of things to help consumers and lawmakers and others become aware of environmental risks. And the backer, the founder of that, Ken Cook, has a passion for good journalism. And, as do I, and we've known each other for a long time. And so we launched the new lead, LEDE, which of course journalists know what that means, right? The lead is the most important, right? The starting point for your story. So we're trying to be the starting point for good environmental journalism, and got a good budget to pay freelancers. So give me a call.
Now you should have shouted that a little. Ears would have pricked up everywhere. So I will put more details on the site for people to look, because of course there's a lot of stuff from the United Nations where passing reports give hints on things like this, environmental problems around the world, and
for sure,
what's happening, and business implications of these things as well. Watch out for major companies prospecting, buyouts and mergers and hive offs, because there's something there under those tectonic shifts, that there is movements of magma. And
Oh, for sure. And with climate change and all the ramifications, now so many different industries are being impacted and are impacting, right, climate change. And so there's a real struggle now between to chart the path, right, that policymakers are looking at, and the powers that be, these powerful companies, are trying to position themselves to, are we the solution? Are we not the solution? There's so much going on, like deep sea mining, is one thing that it's just come up on the new lead. We've been looking at that, talking about that, and mining for these minerals that we'll use in electric vehicle production and other new technologies to try to move us away from fossil fuels. Wow, sounds great. Sounds like a wonderful thing. But what is it doing to marine life and to our oceans and to these essential, parts of the environment there? And is the trade-off worth it or not? You have to always be looking at these, what are the benefits, but what are the costs, and what is the trade-off, and how do we go forward? And that's more important now than probably ever, I think. So environmental journalism is critically important, I think,
the corollary to
all
those
of us.
questions you posed is
Yeah,
who pays the costs and who derives the benefits?
exactly.
Not
So
necessarily the same.
anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to highlight that and talk about that here.
Okay, I think we're coming towards the end now. Thanks very much, Carey. It's been useful. And it just makes you shake your head, and it's in disbelief.
Jaw-dropping. That's the way I describe it. Jaw-dropping.
I mean, well, the EPA is malleable. I know at the time of 9/11, I had a friend from the EPA called me because I was living down by the World Trade Center, and the message came, Giuliani has just said that the air quality is good. So I said, is he lying? And the answer was, the air quality is good, but watch that dust on the ground when the trucks get it.
Yeah.
Manhattan was coated in fallout that was the most toxic, messy, heavy metals and asbestos and silicosis. That wasn't mentioned because it was important to get the center of finance in New York reopen again.
Right.
So the air quality was good.
Yeah. We always find out just a little too late, don't we?
Well, I got it at the time and I believed them. Okay then. Well, thanks very much, Carey. And
thank you.
look forward to see you again soon.
Yep.
And let us hope the new lead prospers and the other ventures, and perdition to all of the enemies.
Thank you so much. It was great
Thanks
talking with you. Thank you.
Ian Williams with the Foreign Press Association in New York, and I've been talking to Carey Gillam about the vagaries of environmental protection in the chemical industry. Thank you very much. See you again soon. Bye.
Bye.